nice to see all your smiling faces again. Today we're talking about egoism. I thought I'd start by putting up this kind of contrast image of someone who's stereotypically really kind and generous and someone who's stereotypically not those things. For a couple of points I'll make just at the outset. One is that we sometimes speak of people as being egotistical, and this is supposed to pick out a particular kind of character, so this is not a claim that everyone is a certain way, but when we say, gosh, that person's got a raging ego, like we might say about Donald Trump, we're meaning to say there's something kind of distinctive and, in some sense, defective about him. He's too caught up in, his own world and obsessed with his kind of lofty self-image, and he doesn't really care about other people, or a bunch of different things like that. So when we talk about egoism, we're not talking about that. We're not talking about the particular defect of personality that clusters in certain individuals that makes them care about themselves way too much and other people not enough. We're talking about something which supposedly, so people who defend this thesis egoism would say, is true equally for all of us. So it's as true for Mother Teresa as it is for Donald Trump, as it is for any of us. And it's a claim about the deepest underlying structure of our motivations. So whatever our superficial motivations, whatever our proximate motivations might be, for, acting in certain ways and the way we treat other people, way deep at the core of it, at the bottom of it all, the egoist is going to say we're all identical. Our motivational structure is identical. And it all refers back to self-interest, right? So I hope that contrast is clear, right? Just the way to remember it, I think, is to remember any pair of people where one of them's like a real saint and one of them's a real jerk. I think when we're talking about egotism, that's the kind of thing that differs between different people to some extent. When we're talking about egoism, the claim is, whether this claim is true remains to be seen, but the claim is that everyone's identical in this respect about the fundamental motivational structure. So I'm going to just start by kind of checking in, this is the kind of question, the question being, is this true? Is this what we're all fundamentally like in our motivations, that can arise quite naturally in our conversations with other people and talking about our lives and their lives? I'm interested to know, is this a question that has come up for any of you in your friendships or your relationships with your family or loved ones? This, has the question naturally arisen, are we all fundamentally self-interested or not? No?
Well, one side of my family is very narcissistic, so I guess they would consider it.
So the question comes up when you're talking about them, are they all fundamentally self-interested?
Yeah, more like just an observation.
Right.
Of myself, yeah.
But do you think that whatever it is that drives them, that there is something similar in all of us and it just expresses itself differently in different people?
I think it's to different extents in different people.
Okay.
Maybe we all have a tiny bit, or I think you have to have a tiny bit for self-preservation, maybe.
Yeah.
But it's just, how it manifests and how it affects other people.
Yeah. So maybe it's worth re-emphasising then just precisely what the egoist is claiming. I mean, the egoist is saying that, yes, this impulse manifests itself differently in different people, but the extent to which it's true of any different person that they are fundamentally self-interested, it's just the same for everyone, right? There is this kind of equivalence between all of humankind. So that, of course, that may or may not be true, but that's the claim that we're kind of zeroing in on, right? Does anyone? Oh, yeah, please.
I thought about it in terms of my own actions sometimes. For example, I always give you a list in my car.
You always?
I always give you a list in my car.
Right.
I'm always the person can you lift? Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah.
And thinking about actions like that, which you sort of think is accountability to help my friend.
Yeah.
But then I'm kind of do you buy me a coffee or something?
Yeah.
I'm sort of wondering whether it's actually because I want to be liked or I want to be some sort of self-interest in all motivation.
That suspicion can kind of quite easily turn inwards, right?
Yeah.
Does anyone know this program, Please Like Me, Josh Thomas?
Yes. Yeah.
So the character that he plays in the show is sort of someone who is in some ways quite nice and good to his friends, but he's got no faith in his own goodness. He just recognises that he's desperate for other people to like him, and so when he's nice to them, it's kind of he's always kind of suspicious of his motives in that way, which I think is quite interesting. Does anyone have a friend or someone in their family or extended kind of social networks who's an inveterate do-gooder, who just can't help being kind of always a bit of a kind of goody two-shoes or something like that? Yeah. I have some friends who are like that. I think those people can trigger these thoughts particularly strongly, right? So you think about two kinds of people. You have one person who's a mix. You know, sometimes they behave in a somewhat self-interested way, but other times they're really generous and kind. I don't find myself being really suspicious about that person's underlying motivational structure. That seems really normal and natural. But the person who's like always seemingly doing things for the sake of other people, there's this part of us that like struggles to believe that that's an honest representation of how they're doing their business in the world, right? And this suspicion that deep down they might be, you know, actually just fundamentally self-interested, and it just expresses itself in this way for this person. It is kind of quite easy to feel for that kind of person. Yeah. All right. Well, so we're going to try to drill down beneath the surface of those impressions and see what some of the philosophical discourse on this question of egoism has had to say. Both about how it kind of structurally interacts with these questions about ethical realism that we were looking at last week, and then some of the, I guess, empirical psychological questions. This is an empirical claim. The claim that people are all fundamentally self-interested is not a kind of claim that we can just sit in an armchair and think about and assess as true or false. Answering that question is going to require consulting some kind of psychological evidence. So we're going to think a little bit about what evidence, if any, could help us answer that question. So here's a quick outline for today. I'm going to say, I'll just quickly reiterate the definitions I've given of egoism and explain why this thesis, if it's true, poses a problem for ethical realism. Remember, just to emphasize something from last week, the kind of master question of this course is, can we be ethical realists? Is there any way to defend the view that there really are objective, categorical moral reasons that all of us are subject to, regardless of our contingent beliefs or preferences or desires, right? So we're starting with egoism because it's one of the oldest and one of the, if you like, kind of most transcendent threats to the idea of ethical realism. So I'll explain a little bit about why that is. Then I'll consult two arguments for egoism, which I don't think really get us anywhere, but they're arguments that might come up, so we should see how, you know, what they say and why they don't really settle the question. I should just like flag terminology like this as I go along. So when I say a prima facie plausible objection, this word prima facie just means on its face. So at first glance, these objections look like they might be credible, but once we dig beneath the surface, maybe not so much. Then we're going to look at this argument that comes out in both of the readings, Bishop Butler's Stone argument. It's a little bit of an elusive argument, so hopefully by the end of this lecture you'll have a firm grip on how that argument works and why philosophers pay so much attention to it when they're thinking about this question. And then at the end we'll talk about how could we actually try to get to the bottom of these questions about what the true nature of people's desires are. Okay, so just to reiterate, egoism, this is a slightly more precise definition than what I gave at the opening. Is the thesis that all human desires, preferences, intentions, and so on, all of our, if you like, intentional attitudes that kind of desire the world to be a certain way, that all of these intentional attitudes are ultimately directed at self-interest rather than genuine concern for other people. Okay? So this is not egotism, which is that personality defect that we see in Donald Trump and Shane Warne and whoever else. Egoism is something that's true of everyone. Or at least, again, that's the thesis that we're examining. And just to reiterate something I said in the opening, so we would call this, if we were giving it its full name, we would call this psychological egoism to distinguish it from other kinds of theses. I'll just use the word egoism throughout this lecture for sort of ease of use, but when we're looking at this kind of psychological egoism, we should recognize at the outset, as I said, that it's a descriptive empirical thesis, right? It's a thesis about how things stand in the actual observable world, right? So fully answering this question is not something that philosophers can do by themselves from the armchair. Philosophy has to kind of interact with empirical discipline, particularly psychology, to try to, I guess, examine this claim. I also wanted to point out here that it's a universal thesis, and this is going to matter a little bit later on. It's a thesis that purports to tell us not just how things are some of the time, but how things are everywhere, in every situation, for every person at all times, right? And part of the difficulty that's going to sort of arise in trying to vindicate psychological egoism is just how strong a claim it is, right? You say that literally in every single instance, every act that people do self-interested motivation. That's a pretty bold claim, yeah? So one thing we should distinguish from at the outset is ethical egoism. So ethical egoism is not a view that we're going to look at much in this course, but it will sort of pop in at a few different points. This is the idea that you see in some ways in the work of Friedrich Nietzsche, if you read him as a moral theorist, or certainly in the work of the sort of Russian-American writer Ayn Rand, who some of you might know, this libertarian thinker, that the true moral principle that we should live our lives by is self-interest. So being fundamentally self-interested is not an immoral way to live one's life. This is actually what morality consists in. So this is a pretty marginal view within ethical theory. There's not many people who kind of come right out and defend this. There's people who, certainly lots of people who think that self-interest is a permissible attitude to hold in some range of cases, but ethical egoism is this quite dramatic claim that this is the whole of morality is actually acting in one's self-interest. So when we talk about egoism, we're not talking about this normative claim, this claim about how people should live. We're talking about the descriptive claim, the psychological claim, right, about how people in fact are. Okay. Now, who's here is studying economics? Anyone? Anyone studying psychology alongside philosophy? One? Anyone studying political science? Anyone doing mathematics and game theory? I mean, this is not like, there are no bonus points to be had for studying any of these disciplines. I just thought I'd mention a few of the other disciplines in which egoism is just treated as a normal axiomatic assumption about how human beings live, right? So think about economics. Imagine that even those of you who don't study economics, you might pick up a little bit about how economists think and the kinds of research projects that they do. Really, all of modern economic theory is built around this assumption that human beings are, to use the sort of slightly technical term, rationally self-interested utility maximizers. And that's just a slightly fussy way of basically saying the same thing as ethical egoism says. People fundamentally always going to act in self-interest. So you can see this because behavioral economics gets really hung up on questions like, why do people waste money on gifts? Right? And economists will kind of hold their head in confusion. It's really fascinating and bizarre that human beings in every society expend and ultimately waste huge amounts of resources on these kind of complex social rituals about the giving and receiving of gifts. And most of the gifts that people get, like the data is unequivocal. Most of the gifts that people get, they don't want, right? Why do human societies waste all this? And the reason that's such a puzzling question for economists is because they're deeply committed to this notion that human beings are all fundamentally self-interested, and so we don't want to just waste money, right? And so they try to construct a more complicated story about how the rituals and practices of gift giving actually do indirectly serve self-interest, right? But most of us don't think any sort of such a complex story is needed to understand why people give gifts, because intuitively we think, well, people sometimes just want to be nice to other people, right? And that's where a lot of the gift giving kind of practice gets up and going. So anyway, the point of all that is just to emphasize that when we think about psychological egoism, we come at that from certain angles and we think that's a sort of a radical, iconoclastic, world-upending sort of thesis, right? And there's a sense in which that's true, but there's also a sense in which lots of parts of kind of human thought and scholarly inquiry already take psychological egoism almost for granted. And when philosophers try to argue against it, as Butler, the Butler argument that we'll be looking at later does, they're actually kind of not, this is a case where they're trying to vindicate the way that most of us think most of the time against people in other disciplines who are criticizing it. Philosophers are often in the habit of taking really unusual views, trying to say, hey, common sense on this question is wrong, you should think this weird thing. But in this case, philosophers are going to other disciplines like economics and game theory, saying, you people will think this weird thing. Actually, the everyday thought that a lot of people have can be defended, and here's how we do it. Okay. So, why does egoism threaten realism? Well, there's this bridging premise. It threatens realism because of the principle of ought implies can. Quick show of hands, who's kind of come across this notion of ought implies can before? Maybe none of you? Okay, so good. So I should take a few minutes on this. Okay, so here's an example. Suppose I claim that you have a personal obligation to provide food for all the starving people in the world. Right? So Adam, you have a duty to save a trillion, that's too many, a billion lives of all the people who, and Adam's going to say, Bob, you're high. I don't have any such duty because I just can't do that. It's nonsensical to claim that I have a duty to do something that I have no ability to do, right? This is a really normal, intuitive thought that I think quite pervasively structures our moral discourse. Blaming someone for something that they had no power to change is like a pretty kind of axiomatic mistake in moral or ethical thought, yeah? Okay, so the fact that you cannot do X is recognised by just about everyone as refuting the claim that you ought to do X, right? Or another way to put this is to say that if someone says you ought to do X, this implies that you can do X. Does this make sense? Right. So any claim about what someone ought to do, where it's false that they can do, it's not the case that they can do that thing, is a kind of defective moral claim. Okay, now this principle can be used to argue against specific ethical claims, like the example I gave before. Someone tries to attribute a particular duty to you, say, hang on, I have no such duty because what you're saying I have a duty to perform is something that I'm incapable of performing. That's pretty straightforward. But it can also be used to argue in a much more general way against whole kind of theoretical approaches within ethics. So this bridging principle of ought implies can is really crucial in understanding why ethical egoism is a threat to, why psychological egoism is a threat to ethical realism. So let me spell the argument out for you really clearly in a sort of premises and conclusion structure. So first premise, nearly all realist ethical theories claim that people sometimes ought to act in ways that prioritise the rights, interests or welfare of others over their own needs, preferences or interests. I say nearly all rather than all just because I mentioned ethical egoism before. So there is this kind of minority of thinkers in ethical theory who think that ethics doesn't require us to prioritise other people's interests over our own. But that's a really unusual view. Just about everyone thinks that it's just par for the course in ethical theory. That's all right. Par for the course in ethical theory that we should sometimes prioritise other people's interests over our own. Okay? Second premise is psychological egoism. So we're just treating this as a premise for the purpose of an argument. And this is the view that we introduced at the start, that people are incapable of acting so as to genuinely prioritise other people's interests over their own. Okay, the third premise is ought implies can, this principle that I mentioned just before. If an ethical claim or theory says that people ought to do something that they are in fact incapable of doing, then that claim or theory is false or illegitimate. So you can see the conclusion that this is going to get us to. Nearly all realist ethical theories are false or illegitimate, because nearly all ethical realist theories say that people should sometimes prioritise the needs of others. Psychological egoism claims that that's impossible. Ought implies can tells us that you can't assign duties to people that they're incapable of fulfilling. Right? So ought implies can is a really, really deeply established principle in ethical thought. Some people occasionally try to, sort of nibble around the edges and criticise it, but basically that's an axiom that frames most of our ethical inquiry. Descriptively, you can just take my word for it if you don't feel confident to assert it for yourself. The descriptive claim that nearly all realist ethical theories claim that people sometimes ought to act in ways that prioritise the rights and interests of others over their own, that's, take my word for it, that's a true description of the state of play. So psychological egoism, if this premise is true, we put that together with two other things that seem really, really plausible, and it gets us to the conclusion that nearly all ethical realist theories are non-starters. Right? So you can see why, if we want to make sense of and ultimately try to defend ethical realism, we have to stare psychological egoism in the face. If it turns out that psychological egoism is true, the whole kind of realist ethical program is under threat. Okay, so now I'm going to do a pop quiz to test whether you've got that. So I hope you've all been awake. So, which of the following statements is an apt summary of the logical relationship between ethical realism and psychological egoism? I'll give you 30 seconds to read options A, B, and C. quiz. I could have brought the cards along, but I thought bring the cards along just for like one quick quiz would be a lot of work. So I'll just get it by show of hands. Out of these three statements, who thinks that A is the most correct summary? Who thinks that B is? And anyone for C? Good, so you've all got the idea. That's great. Okay, I'm glad. This is like one of the important framing thoughts for this week's material. We have to understand psychological egoism in order to see whether realism can work because of the way it bridges together with autumn plays can. That's a cool water bottle. I've never seen a water bottle like that. Yeah? Nice one. Just a quick comment on A and C. So, I'm not meaning to kind of assert that ethical egoism isn't a viable view, but the argument that we're looking at for the relationship between psychological egoism and ethical realism today isn't going to really drill down into that. And as for C, I mean, someone might defend this claim. Someone might think philosophers shouldn't develop views that conflict with what mature social scientific research programs in other parts of the university say. But that's, at the very least, questionable, right? Because psychology as an empirical discipline just makes a kind of philosophical or conceptual assumption at its very core, right? So philosophers quite naturally are going to want to, at the very least, kind of conceptually interrogate the assumptions that structure other disciplines. That's just part of what philosophy does. So we don't normally think philosophy has to fall in line with other social scientific disciplines. Sometimes we think philosophy should fall in line with some well-established empirical theses, and indeed we're going to see this in a minute when we talk about evolution. Okay, so let's march on. I'm going to quickly take you through these two arguments in defense of egoism that have some kind of superficial plausibility, but ultimately don't get us very far. So this will be a bit quick. One is this evolutionary argument. So if you go and talk to the sociobiologists and the evolutionary anthropologists in other parts of the university, they tend to agree that the best explanation for why we have altruistic dispositions, creatures like us living today, is that our sort of evolutionary ancestors, early hominid kind of creatures, a bit like us, who became us, it was adaptive for them to be altruistic and cooperative, right? So we have these traits because there was genetic selection for the traits that disposed us to behave in this way, because the creatures that did behave that way outcompeted and gave birth to more babies and colonized the world than the kind of nearby species that weren't as altruistic. So this is a causal explanation of the origins of our altruistic urges. If you take that as a kind of an established claim, or at least one that's pretty darn plausible, then you might think nobody is genuinely altruistic, because the reason we help other people, the reason we sometimes sacrifice our own self-interest for their sake, is just that there's a kind of, most of us have a hardwired disposition to do this, at least some of the time, and the source of that hardwired disposition is a completely causal evolutionary story that doesn't appeal to any kind of deeper moral claims about how we should act. But that's a little bit quick, so, I mean, the thing is that information about where attitudes come from doesn't tell us anything about their content. So think about, parental love. We can give a big, evolutionary complex story about why parents are kind of consistently disposed to love their children. But the mere fact that we have that story doesn't mean we can look at the parents' love and say, that love isn't genuine love. You don't really love your children. You're just manifesting a trait that evolution conferred upon you. They're just two different questions. There's a causal question about where that trait comes from, but it's a separate question as to what is the content of the attitude. And another way to think about this is just think about, if we're giving causal explanations, okay, an evolutionary explanation is one kind of explanation. It's a long-range explanation about how beings like us came into existence with the temperament that we do. But we could give a different kind of causal explanation. We look at a parent expressing love towards their child, and we say, hey, I can just give you a microphysiological explanation of what's going on in that person. I can tell you about the microphysical processes and the synapses firing in their brain, and that's not real love. That's just like a really complex physical organism, behaving in accordance with the laws of nature. There's a sense in which we're talking past each other when we say something like that. It's true that there is a microphysical causal story that we can tell about what's going on in the brain of beings who love other beings, right? But that doesn't demonstrate that the content of those attitudes doesn't qualify as real love, right? They're just two separate questions. So just uncovering the causal origins of why we behave the way we behave isn't enough to show that it's not real altruism, right? real altruism is about the content of the attitude. Is it directed towards another person or really kind of secretly directed towards myself, rather than any sort of metaphysical claim about where that attitude comes from. Okay. A second kind of argument that I don't think gets us too far is a conceptual argument. So you might think something like this: everybody's intentional actions are motivated by their own desires and preferences, because that's just what it is. That's just what it means for someone to be motivated to perform an intentional action, is that they have a desire that gets enough of a grip on their kind of body to make them act in a certain way, right? It's kind of hard to imagine that your intentions could come from anywhere other than your own psychology, yeah? And there's definitely a kernel of truth in this claim, right? I think it is probably a conceptual truth, or this is not the exact specification of the conceptual truth. There's a conceptual truth somewhere in this neighbourhood, which is something like this, that every motivating preference or desire we have, in some sense, belongs to us at the most basic level of motivation. Okay, but this doesn't entail egoism either, right? Again, it's just a slightly different claim to the one that egoism is postulating. So egoism says, again, that all human desires, preferences, intentions, and so on, are ultimately directed at self-interest rather than genuine concern for others. This is a different claim to the one that all of our interests ultimately belong to us and are kind of residing in our own psychologies. So this is the easiest way, I think, to just make this clear. Think, all of my desires belong to me. That's just what it means for them to be my desires, is that they belong to me, they issue from my psychology. But this doesn't mean that all of my desires are about me, right? It's a further question. So my desire to be, kind to my partner, no one's questioning whether that desire belongs to me. The question is, what's the true nature of that desire? Is that desire really at the ultimate level directed at my partner, or is it secretly, covertly about me, furthering my own interests? Okay, so let's move on from those arguments and drill down into the Butler argument, what we call the Stone argument. There's Bishop Butler. He's like an 18th century English bishop who liked to argue with philosophers of the day and was taken quite seriously and came up with some arguments that we still take seriously today. So here's a passage from the Sermons, which is the first reading for this week. Butler says, "All particular appetites and passions are towards external things themselves, distinct from the pleasure arising from them. There could not be this pleasure were it not for that prior suitableness between the object and the passion. There could be no enjoyment or delight from one thing more than another, from eating food more than from swallowing a stone." Okay, so let me unpack this for you a little bit. The language is slightly obtuse, which reflects the fact that it's nearly 200 years old. But the thought here is something like this. Let's grant that people, at the very least, sometimes act in ways that they believe will bring them pleasure. Nevertheless, it's not like it's not like there are just these units of pleasure out in the world, and I can just go and grab me some pleasure and have it, right? The way that we bring pleasure or welfare or satisfaction into our lives is, in the vast majority of cases, Butler actually thinks in all cases, it's mediated through external objects, right? And this can be lots and lots of different things. So food and drink is an obvious choice, right? It's not that I'm just going out and consuming pleasure per se. I'm consuming a delicious drink or a delicious meal in order to bring me pleasure. Relationships and sex, right? It's not that I just go out and get pleasure as this unconditioned thing in the world. I get pleasure through the joy that comes from relationships, right? This is true for friendships as well. It's true for art and literature. There's lots and lots of things that can bring pleasure into our lives, right? But Butler claims in every single case, we can't just go and get at the pleasure directly. There's something that is the source of the pleasure. Now, so when he talks about that prior suitableness between the object and the passion, what he's talking about there is that, suppose, let's just talk about my particular like for whiskey, right? So, the reason why whiskey can bring me pleasure is because I have some desire or appetite which orients itself towards whiskey, right? And then When I go and drink whiskey, whiskey makes me happy, right? Someone who thinks whiskey is disgusting doesn't get any pleasure out of drinking it, right? Or someone who likes it but suffers with alcoholism and drinking whiskey is like a bad thing in their life. They don't get pleasure, or at least not enduring pleasure out of it either, right? So the thought is, we're imagining Butler's trying to respond to people who think everyone's just self-interested, everyone's just acting for the sake of pleasure all the time, or their own self-interest. And Butler's saying, no, that actually misunderstands how we get pleasure in the world, right? We act for the sake of particular things. When I'm, investing in a friendship or a relationship, I'm acting for the sake of that other person. When I go out and enjoy the arts and listen to music or, watch theatre or something like that, my actions are directed at getting at the external thing and the good stuff that's there. And pleasure is an indirect consequence of that. So it's actually part of it's a really crucial part of the story as to how we act in our own self-interest, that our desires aren't directed at ourselves, that they're directed at something outside of us, right? So yeah, humans are the kinds of beings that generally want to have happy lives and make things go their own way, but the sorts of desires that we need to have in order to live those kinds of lives, it's not just that they can be directed at things other than ourselves, they actually have to be directed at things other than ourselves. So this is supposed to be a story about why desire isn't always fundamentally self-referential. Actually, desire always projects itself out into the world onto other external objects. Okay. So here's a way of summing this up. The claim, this is Butler's claim, is that experiences of pleasure actually depend on someone having a prior desire for something besides their own self-interest. And it's the satisfaction of that independent desire that's the source of the pleasure. Okay, so this is supposed to get you an argument that directs us away from egoism. It acknowledges something in the egoist point of view. It grants that, yeah, human beings want their lives to go well, but the kind of desires we have to have in order for that to work necessarily direct themselves out at other things. Okay. So, where egoism says all our desires are really just directed at serving our own interest rather than being driven by genuine concern for others, Butler says, actually that's wrong. Desires have to be directed at something external to self-interest, otherwise they wouldn't actually serve our interests. And then they can be directed at other people's welfare. That's one of the many things that our desires can be directed at. So this is just a further example to illustrate. You think about the difference between, I don't know, maybe you have these friends who are just natural outdoorsy people, or maybe some of you are like that. I have this friend who just seems to be able to experience joy on a weekly basis or whenever she wants just by going and rock climbing or scuba diving or something like that. I sort of envy her because I find it much more difficult to experience joy, right? But she gets that joy not by being hung up on I just want to feel good today. Rather, she just genuinely loves the activity. She kind of values the activity for its own sake and in its own right. But then the almost ironic thing about that is that the pleasure she derives from these activities like scuba diving, she gets it by valuing the activity in itself rather than just thinking of it as a strategy for getting pleasure. But then this is the thing, the fact that she values it for its own sake actually allows the pleasure to flow really naturally. Whereas someone who's living their life just thinking, where can I get some happiness? I want some units of pleasure. It's actually a really bad approach to living if you want to experience happiness. It's sometimes called the paradox of hedonism, that if you wanted just to have joy and happiness and good feelings, living out in the world and just seeking it directly often tends to thwart that larger aim. Okay, so if desires have to be directed at something external to self-interest, then they could be directed at all sorts of things, and this includes sometimes the welfare of other people. So altruism is possible. It's not like all of our desires are altruistic. Some of my desire for coffee, really no one else is involved in the world when I desire coffee. Butler's claim with the coffee is my desire is not just about me, it's about I love coffee and that's what brings me pleasure, but at least some of my desires can refer to the welfare of other people. And in those cases, what brings me pleasure is seeing their interests served, right? So I get something out of it, but what's the content of my desire? Is that desire referencing my own self-interest? No, it's referencing theirs. That's what the desire is like. So in the Sober and Wilson article, which follows the Butler reading, they kind of schematically represent it like this. This is a really simple picture, but it's just telling us you have a desire for some things, such as food. This causes you to engage in some activity, like eating, and this generates pleasure. The version of this that looks altruistic is you have a desire for another person's good, you engage in a certain activity that promotes that, like an act of kindness, and this brings you pleasure. So the desires that underpin it all aren't fundamentally or necessarily self-referring. And just to reiterate what I said before, this picture is consistent with the idea that, generally speaking, people act, or at least very often act in ways that result in their own pleasure. People aren't all like, masochists who are just trying to bring pain into their lives. We want to bring pleasure into our lives, right? The egoist is kind of right in a sense, but they're wrong about the structure of our desires. Because we bring pleasure into our lives by having desires that aim out at a bunch of different things. Okay, so let me just emphasize two problems with this argument. It's been a very persuasive argument, but it's not like anyone nowadays would say it just finally settles the question and there's nothing more to be said about this. I mean, perhaps the most obvious weakness is that Butler's claim purports to be a universalizing claim. So the egoist was making one kind of universalizing claim. Everyone's interests are fundamentally directed at themselves in every single case. Butler's trying to reject that, but he's rejecting it by kind of ricocheting over to the other extreme, saying, actually, every single desire we have is not directed at ourselves. Every desire is directed at external things. The reason why this seems implausible is because it seems like there are at least some of our desires that don't have to be mediated through external objects in order for them to bring pleasure into our lives, right? So think about the kind of desire that's manifested when you're outside on a lovely day and you just kind of look up at the sun and let the sun wash down on your face, maybe in spring after a long cold winter, right? It doesn't seem like there is any desire to see the sun or some sort of more externally oriented desire. The desire is just, oh, this feels good, and that motivates an action that orients you towards immediate sensory pleasure. And equally, think about what motivates you to avoid immediate sensory pain, right? You accidentally touch the hot piece of cookware and pull your hand away. It's not like the motivation there is mediated through some desire that's oriented or aversion that's oriented at an external object. It is just this immediate thing. I want to feel pleasure, I don't want to feel pain. It seems like that has to be true for at least some of our desires. Some of the structure of our motivation is just kind of directly aiming at self-interest. So Butler is, at the very least, it seems like he's overstating his case. We think the most plausible version of Butler's view would be one that says not that every single desire is like this, but just that quite a lot of our desires are directed at external objects. Okay, that's just what I said. But here's the more serious weakness in Butler's argument, and this comes out in the reading from Sober and Wilson, which I hope you've had a chance to look at. You might think that even if we grant the story that Butler's telling about the way that pleasure gets mediated through desires that aim at external objects, that doesn't really answer the challenge that the egoist was posing, right? Because it could be that desire that directs at other things in the world, my desire for food, my desire to be nice to my friends, my desire to go and enjoy the arts, is just a kind of proxy desire, and that underlying that desire is what the psychological egoist claims, just a desire for my own self-interest. And so that's my fundamental desire, and that generates all of these proximate desires that orient themselves towards external objects. So if you've looked at the Sober and Wilson article, they kind of diagrammatize it like this, where Butler was saying it all kind of bottoms out in a desire for food and not keeping that part wasn't on the table. Sober and Wilson are saying, kind of joining with the egoist and saying, well, look, yeah, we recognize that our pleasure is mediated through things like desire for food and desire to be nice with people, but the egoist can agree with all that, right? Because the egoist is making a claim about what our most fundamental desires are. They're happy to concede that, yeah, we have these surface level desires that aim at other things, but their claim is that what sits underneath all of that is a fundamental desire that aims at self-interest. Sober and Wilson. This is just a very short, the reading from them is quite short. I think this is the passage that really hits the nail on the head. They're saying hedonism, which is a particular kind of egoism, but would, for the purpose of this discussion, the structure of the claim is just identical. Hedonism attempts to explain why people want external things. It does not deny that they do. right? If we understand the egoist in that way, they're not trying to deny that people sometimes want to help other people. They're trying to explain that desire, and they're trying to explain it in terms of a deeper desire or preference, which is fundamentally self-interested. Okay, so see where this gets to. It gets us to a discourse. The question we're going to have to answer to resolve the challenge that egoism poses to ethical realism is about the fundamental nature of our desires. That's a pretty hard question to answer. Let me just kind of construct the dialectic for you. So there's this simple view that one might start off with, which is that we're all motivated to satisfy our own desires, right? But this doesn't establish egoism, because the question, which Butler's argument kind of focuses our attention on, is, right, what do our desires aim at? Right, that we're all motivated to satisfy our own desires. All of our desires belong to us. That's kind of conceptually, trivially true. But to defend egoism, we have to claim that those desires aim at self-interest. Okay, but then Butler's view, which is that our desires have to aim at external objects, this doesn't refute egoism, because it could still be the case that our proximate desires are underwritten by deeper ultimate desires, which are just to further our own interests. So that's the kind of dialectic of the debate that we're working through here. And then the issue is going to be, is there any way that we can resolve questions about what the ultimate source of people's desires are? So now I want to show you a video. Yeah. Which, just to kind of, it's kind of corny, but just to kind of lead us off with the discussion for the last 10 minutes.
The week, sitting in the crowd of thousands at the Arizona Diamondbacks game, 12-year-old boy watching the game, about to do something that would catch not only their eyes in the announcer's booth, but ours too. We couldn't believe what we were seeing. It was the fourth inning. The player tosses the ball into the stands. Two little boys wanted it, but only Ian McMillan would get it.
Oh, look at that young Brewers fan. Now, wait a minute. Did he get it?
No.
Oh, boy.
Sour. Either sour, the Diamondback man got it.
The announcers watching were with their own play-by-play.
No. Oh, he's bumped
Are you
out.
kidding me? This kid's going to do this?
Yeah, that is big.
Oh, my goodness.
What a nice young
Well,
man.
he's got a Diamondbacks hat. We have to get something for that kid.
We gotta-
Brad.
we gotta-
I can't believe I just witnessed that.
That is
That's just
awesome.
You, young man, are a
Young
star.
man. Awesome.
The game would go on, Ian having given up his prized catch. But then a phone call. It seemed someone had seen his kindness on TV.
He's being told right now that he's being praised on TV.
Yeah, he's big league.
Late today, we met Ian too.
I thought it was the right thing to do. I saw the kid, he was really sad, so I decided just to give the ball back. My mom and my dad taught me that way, so kind of like natural.
Ian didn't leave that game empty-handed. Moments after giving that ball away, the announcers had a special gift for the fans. A baseball bat signed by his favorite player.
Up an autograph bat and a contract for the generous Ian and his buddies.
The box was really, really cool. I was really surprised and I did not see that coming.
He's got good home training.
Yeah, that's a very well-bred young man.
If you do good things will happen to you.
Reminding us all that often what we give
Nice going, young man.
delivers far more in return than even a little boy could imagine. And so we choose Ian McMillan with a lesson for us all. We learned late today that after talking to us, he was off to throw out the first pitch at tonight's Diamondbacks game. Go get him, Ian.
All right, so case file number 1000 in Americans Idiots. I mean, it's kind of hilarious the way that they're just kind of glorifying this young man. But hey, he did a nice thing, right? He really did do a nice thing. So go get him, Ian, or whatever. All right, so we're asking this question: what's the ultimate desire that's driving people's proximate desire to benefit others? Ian wanted to do a nice thing for that other kid who was sad, but what's really driving that underneath? So this is an empirical question. That means it's the kind of question that we should be able to answer by getting some evidence. So, first question, I want to hear from you. What kind of evidence could undermine the hypothesis that Ian's desire to be nice was genuine? Right? Ian's presented to us as a kid who just genuinely wanted to do a nice thing. What kind of evidence could we turn up to cast doubt on that thought?
He might think that he was the reason that the boy was crying because he
Yeah. So he wasn't going to have a good time just sitting there because he knew he'd been like a bit of a meanie, and yeah. But yeah, I think that's really plausible. Up the back here.
Oh, I was gonna say to negate the guilt that he was feeling, especially because the kid looked younger than him.
Yeah.
And it's almost like, I don't know how you would describe it, but like it's almost ingrained in us to like look after like our like younger generation. So he was like an older kid, and it's like, oh shit.
Yeah,
Like,
right.
give it to like the little kid.
And he, maybe he even knows, hey, when people are at the baseball, there's cameras on you, right? This is what happens at the baseball, so I don't want to look like this jerk of a guy, right? Yeah.
He said himself at the end there, do nice things and nice things. So there's that underlying faith that he'll be rewarded.
Yeah. I think that, kind of why I like that video is because, like, it kind of, the whole American media establishment is really uneasy about the prospect of, like someone not being rewarded for a good deed. Like, we've got to give this kid a bat, we've got to make him our hero of the week, right? And we know that we live in a world like this. If you can be seen to be like a really good person, you can sort of perform your generosity, you get kudos, right? Yeah.
People might want to be good, like do something just to make themselves look good. As you say, they want to like signal to other people how much better they are than them, or how much more good they are.
Yeah, so and a particular version of this, think of the way that when you're like around someone who you kind of fancy, how you suddenly become this like, morally enlightened person, and you start like doing things you wouldn't normally do because you want them to think, yay, wow, what a nice guy, or what a nice lady, right? So we know that this is what we're like, right? That's definitely an appropriate source of suspicion for the integrity of our altruistic attitudes, yeah? Another thing that came out in the video is, like he says, my parents tell me to act this way. Was that what you were going to say, Grace? Sorry.
Yeah, so like the mum and dad raised him like that, so it's like maybe he was punished when he wasn't being nice, so it's like, oh,
Right.
I'm in trouble if I don't hand this off.
Yeah, but he's just being conditioned.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. What he really wants to do is just be like, yes, this is so great, but he's being conditioned to...
What he does is his natural reaction when he starts off, he's like, yay!
Yeah. All right, yeah. But then, the universe rewards him grandly for being a nice kid. Okay, so I feel like there's lots and lots of different sources of evidence that can undermine the hypothesis that these desires are genuine. Here's a much more difficult question, though. What kind of evidence could support the hypothesis that the desire was genuine? What further info could we see about Ian, the 12-year-old boy, that would actually reassure us about the genuineness of his altruistic urge?
He didn't expect to get some sort of reward.
Yeah, so something like
But how do you qualify that exactly?
Yeah, if people if we really think that this person has no reason to believe that anyone will ever see what they're doing, then that does feel like some kind of... But there's always room for doubt about whether they could be seen, yeah?
Isn't just making the other person feel good a reward in itself, or...
So that's probably true, but do you think that's evidence of the genuineness of the altruistic urge, or like something, a source of suspicion about it?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's kind of ambiguous, right? Like if I make someone else happy, their happiness causes me to be happy. Is that it's quite difficult to sort of psychologically decode if there's no other rewards being given out to me for that. Am I doing that because that makes me feel good, or because is there even a plausible distinction to be picked apart there between those two sources of happiness?
I'm not sure, but I'd say most people would say that's probably the most genuine type of behavior rather than a monetary reward or something like that. They would see that as more genuine than other.
So actions that aim to if there's going to be any reward, it will just be the happiness of another person.
See that as more genuine than say him knowing he was going to get the bat or whatever.
Yeah, I think that's plausible. It definitely looks more genuine than just getting these kinds of crass rewards. But there is still a kind of reward there that makes it look suspicious. Yeah.
I was going to say, could you say almost like you could support it with like the speed at which he changed his desire? So maybe at the time he was trying to grab the ball, it was a desire to win, a desire to obtain the ball.
Yeah.
And then as soon as he got it, he celebrated, and that desire pleasure was almost fulfilled because he had it. And then a new desire to be nice arose because of the situation where there was a child who also wanted it.
Yeah, so there might be something in that. It's kind of hard to know how an observation of the sort of the dynamic nature of those desires would leave us feeling really confident, but it might in some ways support a sense of the genuineness of this desire. Like if someone comes along and says, look at him, he's just like doing what his parents told him to do. It's like, no, we can see his own psychology kind of playing out in real time. He's experiencing ethical emotions to do with shame and kindness. So maybe that does give us some reason to think that it's really about him and his view on the world rather than just a conditioned action, right? Perhaps? Yeah.
What about when he did get the ball and he ran up to the stand and his friend, it looked like his friend pulled him back and told him that, you know, like whispered something to him.
Yeah.
So then he went and gave the ball to the younger boy.
Yeah.
And his friend, actually, I think it was like him feeling good, like his friend was very proud of him. Like,
interesting,
you know, like when they were in the box later, his friend was like pointing to him.
That's true, yeah.
And so he was actually, you know, getting praise from his peers.
So I think, yeah, it's unclear whether that is a reason to think that his desire is genuinely altruistic or just kind of sneakily selfish, right? Because it's a bit like the last case. It's a bit complex. There's a part of it that does seem like something to do with his character, but a part of it is about getting a reward, a social sanction, yeah? So I just want to make this general observation, and we're nearly out of time, which is that it's actually much harder to find evidence that supports a kind of a vindicatory judgment about altruism. It's really easy to cast suspicion on altruism. It's really difficult to get evidence that makes us trust in the genuineness of other people's altruism. And that might be some kind of problem for egoism. It might be that egoism is a kind of unfalsifiable thesis, the sort of thesis that no amount of evidence of any kind is ever going to dissuade us from holding. And if that's right, then that's actually a problem for egoism. If egoism is a view that's immune to evidence, no matter what evidence you give me about how someone's motivated, I'm still going to suspect that deep down they're just being selfish, then egoism is a thesis that can't be proven false and therefore kind of doesn't have much legitimacy because its truth or falsity is beyond our ken, right? Okay, so we're just out of time quickly. I just want to make this point that we haven't settled the question decisively about what the fundamental nature of our desires are. But if we go with Butler to the point of saying at least some of our proximate desires are other-directed, and it remains an open question what their ultimate nature is, that might be enough to defend ethical realism. Because look at premise 2 here. Psychological egoism says people are incapable of acting so as to genuinely prioritise other people's interests over their own. But if people can prioritise other people's interests over their own, sorry, we're like 1 minute away from being finished. In this proximate way, even if it's true that their ultimate desire is selfish, there is still a prioritisation of other people's interests, and that might be enough for ethical realism. Ethical realism doesn't necessarily tell us that we have to have deeply, genuinely, fundamentally altruistic desires. It just says sometimes we have to prioritise other people's interests over our own, right? So Ian prioritised the little boy's interest over his own, even if he did it for all sorts of reasons that ultimately don't make him look like a particularly noble kid. Nevertheless, he might have still done his duty. And so that might be sufficient to defend ethical realism from this challenge, even while we haven't settled the question about what are we fundamentally motivated by. Okay, so I look forward to talking more about that in Tues. Just a reminder, this first assessment task is super easy. It should just take you a couple of hours. It's just to get you engaged with the reader. That's due next Monday. If you do need a short extension, just email me or those of you who've got Macs and ask for a couple of extra days, but that really should just take you a couple of hours. So crack on with that over the next couple of days. And I'll see those of you in the tube class in an hour.